A dog gave birth to 5 puppies, the vet screamed in terror when he saw what came out. Martha Wilkins sat in her familiar armchair, the evening shadows stretching across her living room floor. The only sound was Rosie's gentle breathing at her feet, a rhythmic comfort in the stillness. The dim table lamp cast a soft glow over the room's simple furnishings, highlighting the collection of framed photographs on the side table. Her eyes settled on one particular photo. Tom's smile frozen in time, his arms wrapped around Rosie when she was just a puppy. Martha's throat tightened. 8 months, she whispered, reaching down to stroke Rosie's golden head. 8 months since he left us, girl. Outside her window, she could see her neighbors going about their evening routines. Cars pulled into driveways. Kids called out their last goodbyes before heading inside. Porch lights flickered on one by one. The world kept moving forward while Martha felt stuck in place, like a record player needle caught in the same groove. Everyone thinks I'm doing just fine, she murmured to Rosie, who lifted her head at the sound of Martha's voice. Mrs. Wilkins, steady as always, they say. She managed a small smile as Rosie's tail thumped softly against the floor. If they only knew how quiet it gets in here sometimes. Martha's hand moved to Rosie's swollen belly, feeling the subtle movement beneath. Your puppies, though? Her voice grew tender. Tom would have loved this. Remember how he used to talk about letting you have a litter someday? The memory brought both warmth and pain. Tom had always had such a soft spot for animals, especially Rosie. The clock on the wall ticked steadily as darkness settled outside her windows. Martha adjusted herself in her chair, determined to stay close to Rosie tonight. I don't know if it'll be tonight, sweet girl, but I'm not going anywhere. She reached for the soft blanket draped over her chair arm and spread it carefully over Rosie's bedding. Looking down at her faithful companion, Martha felt the familiar ache of loss mingle with something else, a tiny flutter of anticipation. These puppies wouldn't fill the Tom-shaped hole in her heart, but perhaps they could bring some life back into this too-quiet house. Her fingers continued their gentle stroking of Rosie's fur as she settled in for the long night ahead. The first rays of morning sun filtered through the partially drawn curtains, casting pale strips of light across Martha's living room floor. She stirred in her chair, her neck stiff from dozing in an awkward position. A soft whimper caught her attention, and she opened her eyes fully to see Rosie pacing restlessly near her bed. Oh, sweetheart, Martha said softly, straightening up and leaning forward. Rosie's sides heaved with quick, shallow breaths, and she kept turning in circles, unable to get comfortable. Martha's heart quickened as she recognized the signs. The labor was beginning. Rosie paused her pacing to press against Martha's leg, letting out another whimper. Martha placed a gentle hand on the dog's back, feeling the subtle tensing of muscles beneath the golden fur. It's all right, girl. I'm right here with you. As she watched Rosie's increasing distress, Martha knew they needed professional help. Dr. Samuel Green's clinic came to mind immediately. She'd met him only twice before, once for Rosie's checkup and again at the grocery store. Both times, she'd been struck by his quiet competence and gentle way with animals. Martha frowned, remembering the whispered conversations she'd overheard at the church potluck last Sunday. Did you see that new vet? Mrs. Peterson had said, her voice thick with disapproval. Moving into Dr. Miller's old practice like he belongs here. Martha had walked away then, unwilling to participate in such talk. Pushing those thoughts aside, Martha focused on what needed to be done. She retrieved Rosie's large carrier from the hall closet and lined it with soft blankets. Come on, sweet girl, she coaxed, helping Rosie inside. The dog settled heavily into the carrier, her breathing still rapid but steady. Martha gathered her purse and keys, double-checking that she had everything they might need. She took one last look around the quiet house before carefully lifting Rosie's carrier. "Dr. Green will know exactly what to do," she assured Rosie, her voice firm with conviction. "That's all that matters right now." The morning air was cool as Martha stepped outside, locking her front door behind her. Her car sat waiting in the driveway, covered in a light coating of dew. The streets were still empty, most of the town not yet awake, as she settled Rosie's carrier securely in the back seat and started the engine. Martha pulled into the small parking lot beside Dr. Green's clinic, the modest building's white paint gleaming in the morning sun. The sign above the door read, "Green Valley Veterinary Clinic," in simple blue letters. She parked close to the entrance, making it easier to carry Rosie's carrier inside. The door chimed softly as Martha entered. The waiting room was neat and welcoming, with comfortable chairs lined against pale green walls decorated with framed photos of happy pets and their owners. The scent of antiseptic mingled with the fresh smell of morning coffee from behind the front desk. Dr. Green appeared from a back room, his white coat crisp and professional. His warm brown eyes showed immediate concern as he spotted Rosie in her carrier. "Good morning, Mrs. Wilkins," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. "Let's get Rosie somewhere more comfortable." He guided them through to a back room that had been prepared for deliveries. A padded examination table stood in the center, surrounded by clean towels and medical equipment arranged neatly on steel trays. Dr. Green helped Martha ease Rosie onto a soft blanket spread across the floor. "How long has she been showing signs?" he asked, kneeling to check Rosie's vitals. "Since early this morning," Martha replied, wringing her hands as she paced the length of the room. "The contractions seemed to start just after sunrise." Dr. Green nodded, his hands gentle as he examined Rosie. "You did exactly right bringing her in. She's progressing well." He reached for his stethoscope, listening carefully to Rosie's heart. "You're doing great, girl," he murmured to the dog, who responded with a tired thump of her tail. Martha watched as he efficiently prepared the area, laying out additional towels and checking his instruments. His movements were precise and confident, each action purposeful. Outside, a few early morning shoppers passed by the clinic windows, their curious glances going unnoticed inside the focused atmosphere of the examination room. "Everything looks good so far," Dr. Green said, adjusting a small heating pad beneath Rosie's blanket. "Her temperature and heart rate are exactly where they should be." He smiled at Martha, who had paused her pacing to stand near Rosie's head. "She's a strong dog, Mrs. Wilkins. We'll take good care of her." Rosie's breathing quickened as another contraction gripped her, and Dr. Green knelt beside her once more. Martha moved closer, her worry momentarily overshadowed by the doctor's calm competence. In this quiet room, with morning light streaming through the windows, nothing existed beyond their shared purpose of helping Rosie bring her puppies safely into the world. Rosie's breathing intensified as the first contraction peaked. Dr. Green positioned himself carefully, his hands steady and sure. "That's it, girl," he murmured, his voice low and encouraging. "You're doing great." Martha knelt beside Rosie's head, stroking her fur gently. "I'm right here, sweet girl," she whispered, her heart racing with anticipation. The first puppy arrived with Dr. Green's expert guidance. He quickly cleared its tiny airways, and the examination room filled with a high-pitched squeal. "A healthy boy," he announced, carefully passing the wet bundle to Martha. She cradled the puppy close before placing him near Rosie's warm belly. Minutes ticked by as the second puppy emerged. Another boy, just as vigorous as his brother. Martha's eyes welled up as she watched the tiny creature squirm toward his mother. Dr. Green worked efficiently, his movements precise and gentle. The third puppy, a girl this time, arrived quickly after her brothers. Her cry was softer but clear, bringing a fresh wave of tears to Martha's eyes. Dr. Green handed her the pup with a quiet smile, his calm demeanor never wavering. "3 down," he said softly, checking Rosie's vitals between contractions. "She's handling this beautifully." The 4th puppy made his entrance into the world as the morning sun streamed through the clinic windows. "Another boy," he announced his arrival with a strong cry that made Martha laugh through her tears. She placed him alongside his siblings, watching as all 4 puppies instinctively found their way to nurse. Martha's chest felt full to bursting as she watched the new family. These tiny lives, so fresh and pure, seemed to fill some of the empty spaces in her heart. She glanced at Dr. Green, who gave her an understanding nod as he prepared for the 5th and final delivery. Rosie rested between contractions, her 4 puppies nursing contentedly. The examination room felt peaceful now, worlds away from Martha's earlier anxiety. She watched the puppies, each one perfect and precious, while they waited for their last sibling to join them. The final contraction came strong and steady. Rosie pushed, and Dr. Green guided the 5th puppy into the world with practiced hands. Martha exhaled softly, ready to welcome this last precious life. Dr. Green lifted the tiny pup, his movements precise as always. But then his fingers froze mid-motion. The instrument in his other hand wavered slightly, nearly slipping from his grip. His shoulders tensed, and his calm demeanor cracked. Martha's heart skipped. "Dr. Green," she whispered, taking a step closer. He didn't respond immediately, instead parting the wet fur on the puppy's side with careful fingers. His breath caught audibly, and Martha watched his face pale slightly under the bright exam room lights. The silence stretched, broken only by the soft whimpers of the other puppies nursing nearby. Martha gripped the edge of the exam table, her knuckles whitening. Just moments ago, the room had felt warm with joy and possibility. Now an unexplained tension crackled in the air. Dr. Green's usual steady hands trembled slightly as he continued examining the puppy. Whatever he saw in that marking seemed to shake him deeply, though he struggled to maintain his professional composure. Martha swallowed hard, watching his face. Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Green hesitated, his eyes still fixed on the puppy. He started, then stopped. After another moment, he carefully placed the tiny pup next to Rosie, ensuring it could nurse. But his troubled expression remained, and Martha felt her earlier sense of peace slip away. She reached out to steady herself against the cool metal of the exam table, her heart heavy with sudden worry. The joy of just minutes ago felt distant now, replaced by an unsettling uncertainty that filled the small room. The evening settled softly around Martha's home as she sat on a worn footstool, watching Rosie nurse her newborn puppies in the whelping box. Warm lamplight cast gentle shadows across the living room walls, and the quiet was broken only by tiny puppy whimpers and the sound of contented feeding. Martha's fingers absently stroked Rosie's silky ears while her mind wandered back to Dr. Green's reaction. She could almost hear Mrs. Peterson next door telling her bridge club about how the new vet had completely lost his composure, though Martha knew that wasn't true. Still, in a town this small, even the slightest ripple could become a tidal wave of gossip. The 4 older puppies squirmed and pushed against each other, their little paws kneading as they nursed. The 5th one, the one with that strange marking, seemed just as healthy and eager as its siblings. Martha studied it carefully, trying to understand what had disturbed Dr. Green so deeply. The pattern in its fur didn't look frightening to her, yet she couldn't shake the memory of the vet's shaken expression. "What will they say about you, little one?" she whispered, more to herself than to the puppy. She could imagine the conversations happening over dinner tables across town, worried whispers about abnormal births and what it might mean. Even though no one had come knocking tonight, Martha felt the weight of unspoken judgments pressing in from beyond her walls. The thought of how quickly fear could spread troubled her deeply. She'd seen it before, how innocent things could become twisted by speculation and worry. Dr. Green was a good vet, she knew that much. His reaction meant something, even if she didn't understand what. Martha shifted on her stool, careful not to disturb the peaceful family scene before her. Tomorrow would bring visitors, she was certain. Neighbors with casseroles and concerned expressions, each hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious marked puppy. She'd need to find a way to protect these innocent creatures from becoming the center of the town's fears. Rising quietly, Martha moved to the window and pulled back the curtain slightly. The street outside lay dark and still, no curious onlookers lingering tonight. But she knew this peace was temporary. With a deep sigh, she turned toward her bedroom, leaving Rosie and her puppies to their quiet corner. Several days had passed, and Martha stood at her front gate, watching the subtle dance of avoidance play out before her. Mrs. Henderson, who usually stopped to chat about her prize-winning roses, hurried across the street with determined steps. Mr. Patterson, the retired postman who loved discussing the weather, suddenly found his shoelaces fascinating until he was well past Martha's property. Inside, the puppies tumbled and played in their whelping box, their eyes now open to the world around them. Martha had taken to calling the marked puppy Pippin, hoping the cheerful name might somehow counter the dark whispers that had begun to circulate through the neighborhood. She watched as Pippin wrestled with a sibling, just as playful and innocent as the others. "Such silly nonsense," Martha muttered to herself, thinking of the latest rumor she'd overheard at the grocery store. Something about Dr. Green bringing bad luck to their quiet town. The absence of her usual Sunday morning greetings at church had cut deeper than she'd expected. The same people who had brought casseroles when her husband passed now couldn't meet her eyes across the pews. Her late husband Tom would have known how to handle this, she thought. He'd always said that people's fears often spoke more about their own troubles than any real danger. "Look for the good in folks, Martha," he'd tell her. "It's there, even when they make it hard to find." But as she watched another neighbor hurry past with averted eyes, that optimism felt like a flame struggling against a cold wind. Martha stepped onto her front porch, hoping to catch someone, anyone, willing to stop and chat. The morning was mild, her garden beds neat and colorful, yet the street felt as empty as a desert. The silence from her neighbors pressed against her, like a physical weight. This place, where she'd lived for decades, where everyone once knew everyone else's business and somehow made it feel like caring instead of prying, had transformed into something unrecognizable. She watched Pippin wobble across the whelping box on unsteady legs, batting playfully at Rosie's tail. There was nothing sinister about this tiny creature, nothing to justify the growing wall of suspicion that surrounded her home. Yet with each passing day, Martha could feel the distance growing, could sense the whispered conversations that stopped when she approached. Back inside, Martha closed her front door gently, the quiet of her house broken only by puppy squeaks and Rosie's contented sighs. She stroked Rosie's head, drawing comfort from the dog's steady presence. The challenge ahead seemed enormous. How to change minds already sealed shut by fear. But she refused to let Pippin or Dr. Green bear the burden of these baseless suspicions. The late morning sun filtered through Martha's kitchen windows, catching the sugar crystals sprinkled atop her freshly baked muffins. She adjusted the display of cookies and small cakes on her dining table, making sure each treat looked as inviting as possible. The warm, sweet scent of vanilla and cinnamon drifted through her home, a comforting aroma that usually drew neighbors from blocks away. Outside, Martha positioned a folding table near her front porch, carefully arranging a handwritten sign that read, "Bake Sale, supporting our local animal shelter." She checked on Rosie and the puppies in their pen, now set where visitors could easily see them. The puppies tumbled over each other playfully, Pippin's distinctive marking visible as he wrestled with his siblings. As the morning wore on, a few tentative figures appeared at the edge of her yard. Mrs. Cooper and her daughter Emily stood at the gate, their usual friendly smiles replaced with uncertain glances toward the puppy pen. Martha stepped forward, offering her warmest welcome and gesturing toward the coffee carafe she'd set out. "The snickerdoodles are still warm," Martha said, trying to bridge the uncomfortable silence. Mrs. Cooper nodded stiffly, but remained rooted near the gate. "2 doors down," the Petersons whispered to each other, pointing discreetly at Pippin before hurrying away, without even approaching the bake sale table. The few people who did venture closer kept throwing nervous glances at the puppies, as if expecting something alarming to happen at any moment. Martha watched as plate after plate of cookies and muffins sat untouched. Even her famous apple cinnamon cake, usually the first to disappear at church socials, remained whole and unsampled. She tried engaging those who stayed, speaking softly about the shelter's needs and the puppies' sweet personalities, but her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The Richardson sisters, normally chatty and eager for neighborhood news, exchanged worried looks before making excuses about another engagement. They practically scurried away, leaving their coffee cups untouched on the edge of the table. As the morning stretched toward afternoon, Martha's heart grew heavier. The yard stood nearly empty now, her baked offerings largely untasted, the donation jar containing only the seed money she'd placed there herself. She glanced at Rosie and her puppies, peaceful and ordinary in their pen, showing nothing of the darkness people seemed determined to see in them. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the blinds of Dr. Green's clinic. He sat at his desk, methodically reviewing patient files while trying to ignore the growing knot in his stomach. Today's appointments had been particularly difficult. Clients who once chatted warmly now barely met his eyes, rushing through their visits with clipped responses. In the examination room, he wiped down surfaces that were already clean, his movements mechanical. The sterile smell of disinfectant filled the air as he reorganized instruments that didn't need organizing. Each curt interaction from the day replayed in his mind. The way Mrs. Thompson had pulled her cat's carrier closer when he approached, how Mr. Jenkins had declined his usual post-checkup questions about his dog's diet. Later, in his small apartment behind the clinic, Dr. Green stood among his partially unpacked belongings. Cardboard boxes lined the walls, their contents still waiting to find permanent homes on shelves and in drawers. His eyes lingered on these boxes, considering how simple it would be to tape them shut again, to load them into his car, and drive away from all this unspoken hostility. A gentle knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Martha Wilkins stood there, her kind eyes taking in his troubled expression. "I thought you might need a friendly face today," she said softly. Dr. Green sighed, gesturing for her to enter. "I'm wondering if I made a mistake coming here," he admitted, his voice heavy with resignation. "The town seems determined to see the worst in me." Martha settled into a chair, her presence steady and reassuring. "My Harold used to say that sometimes the most important things in life aren't obvious at first glance," she said. "This town needs a good veterinarian, Dr. Green. More than that, it needs someone who can show them that their fears are unfounded." "I'm not sure I have the strength to be that person," he replied, glancing again at his boxed-up life. "You already are that person," Martha insisted gently. "Every time you treat an animal with skill and compassion, every time you face their prejudice with dignity, you're already showing them a better way." Dr. Green listened, feeling the weight of her words settle against his doubt. Though uncertainty still clouded his thoughts, Martha's quiet confidence offered a counterpoint to his despair. The morning dew sparkled on the grass as Martha stepped onto her front porch, the wooden boards creaking softly beneath her feet. Rosie and her puppies were nestled in their sheltered corner of the yard, the little ones eagerly having their breakfast, while their mother watched with patient devotion. Martha's eyes fell on something unexpected, a small basket placed carefully near the porch railing. Inside, she found neatly folded blankets, soft to the touch and perfect for the growing puppies. A simple note lay tucked among the folds. For the pups. Nothing more. No signature to reveal the giver's identity. Standing there, Martha felt a warmth spread through her chest as she gazed up and down the quiet street. She thought of Caroline, remembering their brief encounters and the understanding that had passed unspoken between them. This gentle gesture bore the hallmarks of someone who knew what it meant to face judgment. Later that day, the creak of her front gate drew Martha's attention. Eloise stood there, clutching a tin of biscuits, her posture uncertain, but her chin lifted with quiet determination. "These are for Rosie," Eloise said softly as Martha approached. Her voice wavered slightly, but her eyes were kind. "I thought she might need extra nourishment, with the puppies and all." Martha accepted the tin with a grateful smile. "That's thoughtful of you, Eloise. Would you like to come see them?" Eloise nodded, following Martha to where the puppies lay. They watched the little ones tumble over each other, Pippin among them, playing just as naturally as his siblings. "They're beautiful," Eloise whispered, her earlier nervousness melting away as she observed their innocent play. Martha stood beside her, feeling the weight of these simple kindnesses settle into her heart. The blankets, the biscuits, small gestures perhaps, but powerful in their meaning. While others might cross the street to avoid her house or whisper behind closed doors, these acts of compassion proved that goodness still flourished, quiet but persistent, like flowers pushing through cracks in concrete. The mid-morning sun cast gentle shadows across Martha's front porch as she watched the puppies explore their enclosed space. Rosie moved with patient grace, her little ones wobbling behind her on unsteady legs. Their determined attempts at walking drew occasional glances from passing neighbors who maintained a careful distance. At first, people hurried past, casting quick looks before averting their eyes. But the puppies' endearing antics, tumbling over each other, making tiny yipping sounds, began to capture attention. A few residents slowed their pace, then stopped altogether, watching from what they deemed a safe distance. Martha noticed Mrs. Thompson pause longer than usual at the corner. Then old Mr. Baker, who usually rushed by with his newspaper tucked firmly under his arm, found himself standing still, a slight smile tugging at his lips as one puppy chased its tail in circles. The invisible barrier began to crack when Sarah Miller, who lived 3 houses down, took a hesitant step toward the fence. Martha saw her opportunity and spoke softly. "Would you like to meet them?" Sarah's eyes widened, but she nodded, moving closer. Martha gestured toward Pippin, who had untangled himself from his siblings and wobbled toward the fence. The marking that had caused such concern was still visible, but in the clear morning light, it seemed less threatening. When Pippin reached up and licked Sarah's tentatively extended hand, a surprised laugh escaped her. The sound attracted others, and soon a small group had gathered, their previous fears melting away as they watched the puppies play. "He's actually quite sweet," Sarah said, her voice carrying to the others nearby. More neighbors drifted closer, their curiosity finally outweighing their apprehension. Martha stood back, watching as natural interactions replaced manufactured fears. Each tail wag and playful tumble seemed to chip away at the wall of suspicion that had built up around her home. The morning unfolded in gentle moments of discovery as people realized that what they had feared was nothing more than a puppy with an unusual mark, full of the same innocence and joy as his siblings. Late afternoon sunlight streamed through Martha's curtains, casting long shadows across her kitchen table. She leaned over the scattered papers, each one a carefully worded invitation to the community blessing event at the park. Her fingers smoothed the edges of one flyer, pressing out a stubborn wrinkle as she read over the words once more. Outside, the autumn air carried a hint of crispness as Martha pinned the first notice to her garden fence. The paper fluttered slightly in the breeze, catching the attention of a passing neighbor who quickened their pace without meeting her eye. Undeterred, Martha gathered her remaining flyers and headed toward town. At the church bulletin board, she carefully positioned an announcement between notices for choir practice and a potluck dinner. A few parishioners lingered nearby, their whispered conversations falling silent as she worked. Martha kept her movement steady, though her heart ached at their distance. The grocery store's entrance provided another opportunity. Martha placed a flyer where shoppers couldn't miss it, arranging it neatly among local business cards and lost pet notices. Inside, she glimpsed familiar faces turning away, cartwheels squeaking as they chose different aisles. Standing before the post office, Martha paused. The weight of averted gazes pressed against her shoulders. But she remembered Tom's words about persistence in the face of fear. With renewed purpose, she posted the final announcement. When Dr. Green heard about her plans, his initial reaction was hesitation. Martha watched uncertainty flicker across his face as he considered the implications of such a public appearance. But after a thoughtful pause, he straightened his shoulders and agreed not only to attend, but to speak. "Not about myself," he clarified, his voice quiet but firm. "About animal care and compassion. That's what matters most." Martha nodded, hope blooming in her chest. She could picture it now, neighbors gathering, perhaps tentatively at first, to witness something genuine and good. The puppies, especially Pippin, could show their true nature, and Dr. Green's knowledge and dedication would speak louder than any rumors. Walking home, Martha felt the familiar mix of anxiety and determination that had become her constant companion. Some townsfolk had shown subtle signs of interest in the upcoming event, though few were willing to voice it directly. She had seen Mrs. Anderson lingering over one of the flyers, and young Tommy Peters had pointed it out to his mother before being hurried along. Late morning sunlight poured through Martha's kitchen windows, casting a warm glow across the countertops where she carefully trimmed flower stems. Her practiced hands moved steadily, arranging blooms that would soon decorate the park. In their familiar corner, Rosie and her puppies dozed peacefully, occasionally stirring with soft whimpers and yawns. Martha paused her work to straighten a stack of decorative napkins, then adjusted the small plates she'd set aside for refreshments. The simple task helped quiet her mind, though uncertainty about the upcoming blessing event lingered just beneath the surface. A gentle knock at the back door broke through her thoughts. Caroline stood there, holding a small jar of homemade jam, her smile tentative but genuine. "I thought you might like this," she said softly, extending the gift. "Thank you, Caroline." Martha's voice warmed with gratitude. These small gestures of support meant more than ever now. As she worked, Martha's thoughts drifted to Dr. Green. She'd noticed his tense shoulders and careful movements during his last visit to check on the puppies. He'd examined each one thoroughly, paying special attention to Pippin, as if the puppy's perfect health could somehow validate his presence in the community. His dedication was evident in every gentle touch, every careful notation in his records. Watching Rosie tenderly clean one of her pups, Martha felt her resolve strengthen. The mother dog's unconditional care for her baby spoke volumes about what really mattered. The simplicity of this love, this basic act of nurturing, stood in stark contrast to the complicated fears that had taken root in town. She picked up another flower stem, continuing her preparations with steady hands. Though challenges remained, Martha held on to her faith that small steps forward, like Caroline's visit today, could eventually bridge the widest gaps. Time and patience had their own quiet power, working gradually to soften hearts that fear had hardened. The morning continued peacefully as Martha arranged her flowers, the gentle domestic sounds of puppies playing, providing a soothing backdrop to her work. She placed Caroline's jam jar on the counter, its presence a tangible reminder that kindness still flourished, even in uncertain times. Midday sun cast long shadows across Martha's front porch as she swept fallen leaves from the wooden steps. The autumn air held a distinct chill, making her pull her cardigan closer. Inside, Rosie and her puppies slept soundly after their feeding, their gentle breathing barely audible through the screen door. Martha hummed an old hymn, finding comfort in the familiar routine of tidying her space. The rhythmic swoosh of the broom against wood helped steady her thoughts about tomorrow's blessing event. The sound of quick footsteps drew her attention. Dr. Green approached, his usual measured pace replaced by urgent strides. In his hand, he clutched a folded piece of paper. Without greeting or preamble, he extended it toward Martha, his expression grave. She took the paper, noting how his hand trembled slightly. As she unfolded it, her eyes widened at the crude message scrawled across the page. The words threatened violence if Dr. Green didn't leave town. Martha's hands shook as she lowered the letter, her face draining of color. "I almost packed everything last night," Dr. Green admitted, his voice unsteady. "Just threw it all in boxes and drove away." Martha reached out, gently gripping his arm. Words failed her as they stood there, the threatening letter hanging between them like a dark cloud. All their careful plans, the small victories of recent days, seemed to crumble in the face of such naked hatred. Drawing a deep breath, Martha tried to summon her usual certainty about patience and perseverance. "We must be careful," she managed, though doubt crept into her tone. The question nagged at her. Had she been naive to think gentle persistence could overcome such deep-seated prejudice? If someone would resort to threats of violence, perhaps they had underestimated the danger they faced. They stood in tense silence, the swept leaves scattering in a sudden gust of wind. The peaceful setting of her porch now felt exposed and vulnerable. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Martha gestured toward the door, and they stepped inside to the warmth of her living room, where Rosie and the puppies slept on, blissfully unaware of human cruelty. Early evening shadows stretched across Martha's sitting room as the day's warmth faded. The puppies dozed on a folded blanket near the hearth, their soft breathing the only sound disturbing the heavy silence. Martha leaned against the arm of her chair, the threatening letter's words still burning in her mind. A gentle creak of floorboards drew her attention to the open door. Eloise and Caroline stood there, hesitation clear in their postures. Caroline clutched a tin of biscuits, while Eloise held a carefully folded quilt. Their eyes held a mix of concern and gentle understanding. Without a word, Martha handed them the threatening note. They read it twice, faces shifting from disbelief to dismay. Eloise's hands trembled slightly as she lowered the paper. "I almost didn't come today," Eloise admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Fear does that to you. But these puppies..." She glanced at the sleeping litter. "They reminded me what innocence looks like, how simple love can be." Caroline nodded, setting down her tin of biscuits. "When I adopted my child, people whispered, judged. One woman at the grocery store, she barely knew me, stood up for me that day. That single act of kindness gave me strength for months. Dr. Green sat quietly in the corner, his expression torn between weariness and something deeper, a conflict between self-preservation and professional duty. He watched as these women, virtual strangers days ago, stood firm in their support. We can't let fear win," Eloise said, straightening her shoulders despite her naturally timid demeanor. "Not again." Caroline spread her quilt over the back of a chair, her movements deliberate and sure. "Sometimes the hardest thing is standing still when everything in you wants to run. But you're not alone anymore, Dr. Green. Neither are you, Martha." The room fell quiet again, but the silence felt different now, less heavy, more like the calm after a storm. Dr. Green's posture shifted slightly, the tension in his shoulders easing as he absorbed their words of solidarity. The lamp in the corner of Martha's sitting room cast a warm, gentle glow over the small gathering. Dr. Green sat forward in his chair, his hands clasped together as he gathered his thoughts. Rosie and her puppies dozed peacefully nearby, their quiet presence a gentle reminder of what truly mattered. "My father was a veterinarian, too," Dr. Green began, his voice low but steady. "In a town not so different from this one, people weren't always kind, but he never wavered." He paused, a distant look crossing his face. "I remember watching him tend to a farmer's prize horse late one night, even after that same farmer had refused to shake his hand earlier that day." Martha dabbed at her eyes with the corner of her sleeve. The story struck a chord deep within her, echoing memories of her late husband's unwavering faith in doing what was right, regardless of the cost. "Dad told me something I've never forgotten," Dr. Green continued. "He said that healing knows no prejudice. Animals don't care about the color of the hands that help them. They only know kindness or its absence." Eloise and Caroline listened intently, their faces reflecting both the weight of his words and growing determination. The room felt charged with quiet purpose as Dr. Green straightened in his chair. "I won't leave," he said firmly. "These animals need care, and those who trust me deserve nothing less than my best. My father didn't run, and neither will I." Martha nodded, recognition filling her eyes. "Your father's strength lives in you," she said softly. The lamplight continued to flicker warmly as the four sat in companionable silence, their shared resolve creating an invisible shield against the darkness of prejudice that lay beyond Martha's walls. Dr. Green's decision to stay, inspired by his father's example, had transformed their individual stands into a united front. The early morning light painted the willow tree's branches in soft silver as Martha stood beneath them, leaflets clutched in her hands. The paper felt crisp, each one containing simple words about the blessing event. Her neighborhood lay quiet around her, houses still drowsy in the pale dawn. Caroline appeared first, her footsteps determined on the sidewalk. Without many words, she fell into step beside Martha. Together, they moved down the street, offering leaflets with gentle smiles. They kept their message simple, just the time, the place, and a warm invitation. "It's this Saturday at 2, Martha would say softly, extending a flyer. "Everyone's welcome," Caroline would add, her voice steady and kind. Near the post office, Eloise joined them, her hands slightly trembling as she approached the community notice board. A few people stood nearby, watching silently as she carefully pinned up another flyer. Martha noticed how Eloise's fingers shook, but admired her friend's courage. "It's about bringing people together," Eloise explained to an onlooker who lingered. "About remembering what makes us a community." At his clinic, Dr. Green moved through his morning appointments with careful precision. He spoke clearly to each patient's owner, explaining treatments and medications with patient detail. His manner remained professional, his focus unwavering as he tended to each animal's needs. "Just a mild ear infection," he assured one worried dog owner. "The drops will clear it up in a few days." His voice stayed warm and steady, though uncertainty clouded his thoughts between visits. As evening settled, Martha lit a single candle in her living room. The flame's glow touched the sleeping puppies, their small bodies rising and falling with peaceful breaths. She closed her eyes briefly, remembering how her husband used to say that goodness often appeared in unexpected moments. The whole day had passed in a gentle rhythm of small actions, extending invitations, posting notices, treating patients. No dramatic confrontations had occurred, but neither had there been any clear signs of acceptance. Instead, curious glances and thoughtful pauses suggested that perhaps somehow their message was beginning to reach past the walls of prejudice. The morning dew still clung to the grass as Martha arrived at the park, her arms full with a wicker basket and a glass pitcher of fresh lemonade. The oak tree's broad branches cast dappled shadows across the ground, where she began arranging folding chairs in a welcoming semicircle. Her movements were deliberate and gentle as she set out plates of cookies and muffins on a small table. People began appearing just as the sun climbed higher. They came cautiously at first, an elderly couple here, a young family there. Soon more followed, their footsteps hesitant but drawn forward by something stronger than fear. Whispered conversations floated through the morning air as neighbors gathered in growing clusters. Dr. Green stood quietly beside Martha, his pressed shirt and neat tie reflecting his professional dignity. He tugged once at his collar, then stepped forward to address the assembled crowd. His voice carried clearly across the grass as he spoke about animal care and the nature of unusual markings in pets. With measured words, he explained how surface differences, whether in animals or people, often led to unnecessary fears. "What appears strange to us," he said, gesturing toward the puppy enclosure, "is simply nature's variety at work." The puppies tumbled and played within their safe space, Pippin among them. The marked puppy's distinctive pattern was clearly visible now, no longer hidden away. The crowd fell silent, watching as Pippin romped with his siblings, displaying the same playful spirit as any other young dog. Martha noticed the subtle shift in the atmosphere as several people moved closer to the enclosure. Even those who had avoided her house weeks ago now leaned in with interest, small smiles forming as they watched the puppies' antics. A few children pointed excitedly, their parents no longer pulling them back. Tears welled in Martha's eyes as she observed the scene. Neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid her now stood shoulder to shoulder, sharing quiet laughs as the puppies played. The morning light seemed brighter somehow, warming not just the air, but the hearts of those gathered beneath the oak's protective branches. The warmth of the rising sun filled the park as gentle conversation drifted between small groups of townspeople. Martha watched from her spot near the puppy enclosure, heart lifting at the sight of neighbors sampling her pastries and exchanging tentative smiles. The puppies tumbled playfully, batting at fallen leaves, while Dr. Green answered questions about proper animal care. Then the peace shattered. "That thing's a curse on our town." The harsh voice cut through the pleasant murmur. Tom Bradley, known for spreading the darkest rumors, strode forward with several others close behind. Their faces were twisted with anger as they pointed accusingly at Pippin. "Look at that mark. It's an evil omen," someone shouted. "That creature needs to go." The crowd shifted uneasily. People who moments ago had smiled at the puppies now backed away, their expressions uncertain. Martha's hands trembled as she stepped forward. "Please," she said, her voice quavering. "These are just innocent puppies. There's nothing evil here." Dr. Green moved closer to the enclosure, his shoulders tense but his stance firm. "I won't let anyone harm these animals," he stated quietly. "Who asked you?" Bradley sneered. "Go back where you came from. We don't need your kind here." More hateful words followed, ugly slurs that made Martha flinch. The peaceful gathering dissolved into chaos as the angry group pressed forward. Some attendees hurried away while others stood frozen, torn between speaking up and staying silent. The puppies huddled together, whimpering at the raised voices. Tears spilled down Martha's cheeks as she watched the morning's hope crumble beneath the weight of hatred and fear. She placed herself between the angry crowd and the puppy enclosure, her heart breaking as neighbors she'd known for years joined in the cruel chorus of accusations. Dr. Green remained beside her, his face tight with pain, but his resolve unwavering as the hostile group continued their verbal assault. The peaceful morning exploded into chaos as bodies pressed and shifted through the park. Dust kicked up under dozens of feet, creating a hazy cloud around the angry crowd. Martha's heart pounded as she tried to push through the mass of people, desperate to reach the puppy enclosure. Her pleas for calm vanished beneath the roar of angry voices. "Stop this!" she cried, but no one seemed to hear. The tension snapped with a sudden violent surge forward. Someone lunged, and in the confusion, a rough hand struck out at the puppies. A sharp, piercing yelp cut through the mayhem. Pippin's cry of pain silenced everything else. Dr. Green moved with lightning speed. He darted through the crowd and scooped up the whimpering puppy, cradling it protectively against his chest. The tiny creature trembled in his gentle grip. The harsh cry seemed to wake something in the crowd. Several people stepped back, horror replacing anger on their faces. Those who had followed Bradley's lead now looked away, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The sound of an injured puppy had cut through their hatred, leaving shame in its wake. Martha stood frozen, tears streaming down her face as she watched her neighbors transform from kind people into a cruel mob and back again. But their regret came too late. Dr. Green didn't wait for apologies or explanations. With Pippin secured carefully in his arms, he strode away from the park, his expression set with grim determination. His only concern now was getting the injured puppy the care it needed. Martha watched through tear-blurred vision as some people bowed their heads, while others hurried away, unwilling to face what they'd done. Her heart felt heavy as lead as she turned to follow Dr. Green. Each step away from the ruined gathering weighed on her soul, her faith in her community crumbling like autumn leaves. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the clinic's windows as Martha stood behind Dr. Green, her hands clasped tightly at her chest. The gentle hum of distant traffic filtered through the walls, mixing with the steady buzz of overhead lights. In the warm glow of the counter lamp, Dr. Green worked with focused precision over Pippin's small form. His hands moved with practiced care, each motion deliberate and gentle. The metallic instruments gleamed as he examined the extent of the puppy's injuries. The sharp scent of antiseptic hung in the air, a reminder of the serious nature of their situation. Martha's mind drifted to quieter times when her husband's wisdom had guided her through difficult moments. "Kindness always finds its way back," he used to say. Those words felt distant now, harder to grasp in the face of such cruelty. Yet she knew she needed to hold on to them more than ever. The soft whimper from the examination table brought her attention back to the present. Dr. Green's steady movements never faltered as he continued his careful assessment. His dedication showed in every gentle touch, every careful turn of his instruments. Martha's silent prayer filled the space between them. She prayed not just for Pippin's recovery, but for something larger, for understanding to emerge from this darkness. The weight of the moment pressed down on her shoulders as she watched Dr. Green work. His calm focus anchored her, keeping her from drowning in waves of despair. The helplessness she felt contrasted sharply with Dr. Green's quiet competence. This moment, she realized, represented more than just treating an injured puppy. It stood as a testament to the choice their community faced, to embrace compassion or surrender to fear. In the gentle lamplight, Martha blinked back tears, her faith tested but not broken. Dr. Green's steady hands moved with purpose, embodying the very kindness their town seemed to have forgotten. The evening air grew heavy as Dr. Green methodically cleaned his instruments by the sink. His shoulders remained tense, each movement mechanical and precise. Through the clinic's windows, porch lights began to flicker on across the neighborhood, marking the arrival of dusk. Martha stood near the door, her eyes red from crying. She watched Dr. Green's back, waiting for the right moment to break the weighted silence. The soft clink of metal against metal punctuated the stillness. Dr. Green's mind churned with conflicting thoughts. The path of least resistance beckoned. He could pack his belongings tonight and be gone by morning. The memory of hateful words and violence made that option tempting. Yet leaving would mean abandoning not just Martha, but also those few residents who had shown genuine decency. The cost of staying seemed impossibly high, but the price of departure carried its own burden. "Samuel," Martha's voice came out quiet and unsteady. "What they did today, the awful things they said, the harm they caused." She paused, gathering strength. "I know how heavy this weighs on you, but remember the blankets that appeared at my door, the biscuits Eloise brought, Caroline's steadfast support? These small kindnesses matter too." Dr. Green's arms remained folded across his chest as he turned to face her, his expression tight with contained emotion. Martha continued, her voice growing firmer despite its tremor. "If you leave now, they win. Their hatred prevails. But if we persist..." She spread her hands in a gesture of hope. "Maybe others will find the courage to choose a better way." He heard the weariness in her words, but also the unwavering belief that their community held something worth salvaging. Her reasoning pulled at him, making the prospect of departure feel increasingly like surrender. Though uncertainty still clouded his thoughts, Dr. Green found himself unable to imagine leaving without regret. Martha's quiet faith in possibility, despite everything, made him pause. The decision wasn't final, but her words had found their mark. As night settled more deeply around the clinic, Dr. Green set aside the last of his cleaned instruments and turned to face Martha fully. Questions still lingered in his eyes, but he didn't dismiss her plea. Early morning light filtered through the clinic's backroom windows as Dr. Green adjusted his surgical mask. The overhead lamp cast a stark glow across the sterile environment, highlighting the instruments laid out with precise care. In the corner, Martha perched on a small stool, her hands tightly clasped, face drawn with worry. The familiar antiseptic smell filled her nose, mingling with the crisp morning air that seeped through the window frame. Dr. Green inhaled deeply, centering himself before beginning the delicate procedure. His hands moved with steady precision as he worked to repair Pippin's injuries. Each careful motion pushed away memories of angry voices and hostile faces, replacing them with pure focus on the task before him. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead as he concentrated on each delicate step. Hours crept by in tense silence. Martha watched Dr. Green's methodical work, thinking of how her late husband would have appreciated such dedication. Despite her anxiety, small embers of faith flickered in her chest. Every gentle touch, every careful stitch seemed to defy the hatred that had brought them here. Her fingers absently traced the worn edge of her cardigan as she prayed silently. As the surgery progressed, Dr. Green's shoulders gradually relaxed. His movements remained precise but carried a hint of relief as he checked Pippin's vital signs one more time. Exhaustion lined his face, yet determination never wavered as he completed the final steps. The steady beep of monitoring equipment provided a reassuring rhythm to his work. With great care, he lifted Pippin's small form and placed him in a recovery enclosure padded with soft blankets. After removing his gloves, Dr. Green turned to Martha, nodding slightly to indicate that the puppy had made it through the immediate danger. His eyes crinkled with kindness above his mask as he disposed of his surgical gear. "Thank you," Martha whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks. Relief flooded her voice. For the first time since the violent confrontation, she felt something beyond despair. In Dr. Green's quiet competence and unwavering care, she glimpsed proof that hope could survive even the darkest moments. Her trembling hands steadied as she watched Pippin's chest rise and fall with each breath. Morning sunlight strengthened through the window as they shared a look of understanding and cautious relief. The surgery was over, and Pippin had survived. Outside, birds began their morning songs, nature's gentle reminder that life continued its steady march forward no matter what challenges arose. Later that same day, news of Pippin's survival rippled through the neighborhood like a gentle current. The midday sun cast long shadows across the clinic's front steps as hesitant figures approached, carrying covered dishes and baskets. Inside the waiting area, Martha sat quietly, watching through the window as more neighbors gathered, their expressions uncertain and drawn. Dr. Green emerged from the back room, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion, but his posture composed. He opened the door to greet the first visitors, who shuffled in with downcast eyes. The scent of fresh-baked goods filled the small space as foil-covered dishes and mason jars appeared on the counter. Mrs. Thompson, who had crossed the street to avoid Martha for weeks, stepped forward with a latticed apple pie. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice catching. "I believed things without asking why, without thinking." Her hands trembled as she set down the pie. Behind her, old Mr. Jenkins placed a ceramic casserole dish on an empty chair. He cleared his throat several times before speaking. "Should have known better," he muttered, his weathered face flushed with shame. "Been here long enough to know better." Martha received each offering with quiet dignity. "Understanding takes time," she said softly to Mrs. Thompson, "but recognizing our mistakes is how we grow." Her words carried no bitterness, only a gentle push toward reflection. Dr. Green stood near his office door, acknowledging each person with a polite nod. His face remained neutral, neither dismissing the past harm nor rejecting their attempts at amends. When Mrs. Baker presented a jar of her prized strawberry preserves, his thank you was genuine but measured. The atmosphere in the waiting room gradually shifted. Tense shoulders relaxed slightly, and voices grew steadier. People lingered rather than rushing away, as if the simple act of standing together might help rebuild what fear had torn apart. More residents arrived, each carrying something: a loaf of bread, a pot of soup, a basket of muffins. With every offering came stumbling words of regret, halting admissions of shame. Martha met each one with the same steady gaze, encouraging them to face their actions honestly. Early afternoon sunlight streamed through the clinic's large front windows, painting warm rectangles across the neat row of chairs. Martha adjusted a small arrangement of flowers on the side table, taking a calming breath as she prepared for the open kennel day to begin. The first family entered tentatively, followed by others who showed more eagerness. A father guided his young daughter toward Pippin, who stood on slightly unsteady legs, tail wagging in welcome. The child's initial hesitation melted into giggles when Pippin's wet nose found her small hand. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, an elderly couple who had once crossed the street to avoid Dr. Green, approached him with careful steps. "How are all the puppies doing?" Mrs. Henderson asked, her voice gentle. "Has Pippin recovered fully?" Dr. Green answered with patience, describing each puppy's unique personality and sharing encouraging updates about their health. His calm voice drew more people closer, and soon neighbors were kneeling to stroke soft ears and scratch furry bellies. "I'm ashamed we listened to those rumors," someone murmured, while another voice added, "We should have known better." Dr. Green acknowledged each confession with a quiet nod, his presence steady and forgiving. Martha watched from near the reception desk as laughter began to fill the room. The puppies, unaware of their role in healing old wounds, tumbled over shoes and tugged playfully at coat hems. Some curled up contentedly in visitors' laps, their innocent trust drawing genuine smiles from faces that had once shown only suspicion. The conversation flowed more naturally now, mixing questions about puppy care with soft admissions of regret. Children pointed excitedly at the playing pups while their parents spoke in hushed tones about second chances and better understanding. Through it all, Pippin moved from person to person, tail wagging, offering wet kisses and playful nudges that seemed to wash away the last traces of fear and doubt. The morning drizzle painted the small town streets in gentle gray hues. Martha sat on her front porch, a light shawl wrapped around her shoulders as she sipped her morning tea. Through the soft rain, she noticed familiar figures approaching, their arms laden with small parcels. Mrs. Thompson, who months ago would barely meet her eyes, climbed the porch steps with a carefully wrapped knitted blanket. "For the puppies," she said warmly. "The nights are getting cooler." More neighbors followed, some carrying bowls of fresh berries, others bringing homemade treats. The porch, once a place people hurried past, now hummed with quiet conversation and genuine smiles. Eloise arrived, her eyes bright as she settled into a chair beside Martha. "There's something different in the air now," she said softly. "That heaviness that used to hang over everything, it's lifted." Caroline joined them moments later, nodding in agreement. She remembered leaving that first basket of blankets, how uncertain everything had felt then. Now, watching neighbors chat easily on Martha's porch, she felt a deep satisfaction. Dr. Green's familiar figure appeared through the drizzle on his way to the clinic. Instead of the wary glances of before, he received friendly waves and warm greetings. He tipped his head in acknowledgement, a small smile playing at his lips. Martha's fingers traced the edge of a small package someone had left, local pastries wrapped in brown paper. She watched Pippin and the other puppies playing in their pen near the window, their joyful energy a reminder of how something so simple had opened hearts that fear had closed. The rain continued a gentle pattern, but no one seemed eager to leave. They passed around coffee and shared stories, the earlier tensions forgotten in the comfort of restored connections. What once felt impossible now seemed natural. Neighbors being neighbors again, the way things should be. Sunlight dappled the grass in Martha's front yard as children's laughter mingled with playful puppy barks. The once quiet street had transformed into a scene of joy, with Rosie watching contentedly as her puppies, now stronger and more adventurous, romped through the yard. Sweet flower scents drifted on the breeze, while neighborhood children attempted to teach the puppies to sit and stay. Their giggles erupted each time a pup toppled over or became distracted by a butterfly. Dr. Green approached along the familiar path, his stride easy and confident. The tension that once shadowed his movements had vanished entirely. He greeted Martha with a warm smile, settling into a chair beside her on the porch. "Beautiful afternoon," he remarked, watching as Pippin chased a young girl's ponytail. Martha nodded, remembering those dark days when she feared he might leave town. Now, neighbors waved as they passed, calling out friendly hellos. Some stopped to chat, their faces bright with genuine warmth. Parents gathered in small groups, sharing coffee and conversation while their children played. One mother, who months ago had crossed the street to avoid Martha's house, now laughed openly as her son attempted to untangle himself from an enthusiastic puppy pile. "Look how far they've come," someone murmured, and Martha knew they weren't just talking about the puppies. The whole street seemed lighter, as if a heavy cloud had finally lifted. Though no one had forgotten the ugliness they'd overcome, it no longer cast shadows over their daily interactions. Pippin bounded up the porch steps, that distinctive marking now nothing more than a curious pattern that made him unique. The puppy settled at Dr. Green's feet, tail wagging as the veterinarian scratched behind his ears. Martha watched it all with quiet satisfaction. This healing had started with small gestures, a jar of jam here, a knitted blanket there, a few brave souls willing to stand against fear. Now those tiny seeds of kindness had bloomed into something beautiful and lasting. Late afternoon sunlight painted the neighborhood in warm golden hues as Martha sat quietly in her porch chair. Before her, the puppies sprawled in various poses across the yard, nearly grown now, their afternoon play giving way to peaceful naps. Rosie dozed contentedly beside them, her maternal duties largely complete. Dr. Green stood a short distance away, tossing a soft ball back and forth with several children. Their delighted squeals filled the air as they competed for his attention. Neighbors walking past called out friendly greetings, and he responded with easy waves, his presence now as natural as the oak trees lining the street. Martha's thoughts drifted through the months behind them. She remembered the initial shock at Dr. Green's reaction to Pippin's marking, the whispered rumors that had poisoned casual conversations, and the terrible confrontation at the blessing event. Each memory carried its own weight of pain, yet each had also served as a catalyst for growth. Those difficult moments had tested everyone's character, forcing them to examine their hearts and choose between fear and understanding. The choice hadn't come easily, but its rewards now surrounded them in the easy laughter of children, the relaxed greetings between neighbors, and the peaceful atmosphere that had replaced suspicion. Pippin rolled onto his back nearby, paws waving lazily in the air, completely at ease with the world around him. Martha watched as one of the children paused their game to scratch his belly, both child and puppy sharing a moment of pure trust. The fear that had once surrounded Pippin's unusual marking seemed almost impossible to recall now, like a shadow that vanished in strong sunlight. Understanding settled deep in Martha's heart as she observed the scene before her. The courage to face fear, to transform it through persistent love and faith, had reshaped their entire community. What began as a challenge to their comfortable assumptions had become a gateway to deeper connections and genuine acceptance. Dr. Green's laughter joined the children's as their game continued, his dark eyes bright with joy. Martha smiled, knowing that each person who had chosen to overcome their prejudice had contributed to this moment of harmony. The painful journey had led them to a place where love truly did conquer fear, one heart at a time. If you enjoyed the story of Pippin, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.